anxietycenter.com.
Well, with the challenges of the coronavirus certainly on top of mind for everyone, there's a number of areas that people might struggle with in terms of how to manage this. Because there's a lot of things we don't know about this virus. One is we don't know how long it's going to last. I mean, we're seeing positive news out of China that the first wave is pretty much coming to an end, so that's good. And that happened very, very quickly within a month or so that's good news. Their specialists are being concerned about the second wave, when that might show up, if there is one. So we're not sure about that. And there's a lot of, I think this is the first time that I can remember being 66 years old. I've never seen a shutdown in the world like this, where everything is being closed down. So that's definitely precedent setting. And so that might be concerning for some people. The other thing is that, people are now being isolated away in their homes, which might be unusual for a lot of people if they're not used to spending a great deal of time in a close environment with family members. Sometimes that in itself can be stress-provoking and anxious-provoking, so there's that stress. We've also got the stress of the financial implications. A lot of industries are shutting down. I'm not sure if they can get employed again. People are losing their jobs. I know governments are offering stimulus packages and bailouts to help people. How that's going to be effectively delivered, I don't have any idea, and I don't think they do yet. So there's that question. And of course, the most obvious is the concern about getting the virus and what happens if you do. So we have all of these concerns that are on people's minds today. And so, we wanted to address some of those. We posted a poll at our website about how people are reacting to the pandemic in terms of questions. And I'm just going to pop that up to see what the latest responses are now. I have to say I was also surprised there too, in terms of the percentages of how many people were and weren't anxious. I'm just going to log in and have a look at the poll now. Out of over 500 responses right now, 21% of responses said, the question was, how often do you worry about the coronavirus? 21% said all the time. 23% said most of the time, so we're at 44%. 28% said sometimes, which I thought would be higher actually. And then once in a while was 15%, and then we have 13% who said never. I was expecting the numbers to be a bit higher on the top categories, somewhere around the 60%. But when you combine the sometimes, we're at that spot. So that's, a good representation of how many people are being concerned about this virus. So to maybe start the conversation going with some of our, I guess guys don't like to be called experts, do you? So
our clients are our experts, Jim.
That's correct.
That's why therapists don't like to be called experts, because we think of our clients as the experts.
Yeah, great. Do you want to just, unpack that for us?
Well, to me specifically, and to a lot of other therapists that I've spoken with on this issue, is, people know themselves best. They know what bothers them the most. They know what their strengths are. They know where they maybe might want to work on some things. They know, ultimately they know what they want out of therapy and deep down how to get there. And so a lot of times it's really just about having somebody to journey with you and give an outside perspective, because we all can get kind of stuck in the situation when we're the ones inside it and we lose that, objectivity. So I myself have been, therapy has been valuable to me. Excuse me, at different times in my past. I'm not sick. I just swallowed wrong. I don't have coronavirus. But so, that I think that's why we kind of just cringe when we hear that word, because, for us, the individual should always be the expert and in their recovery at all times. So,
okay. So thinking of yourself,
we can lend our resources to them to help them in that journey. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, sure. So like being sort of guides, helping them keep them on the track, and offering suggestions and advice where they might be bumping into the edges sometimes.
Right.
Okay. Chris, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Sheri summed it up really well. I think what we want to convey to our clients is that even though they may not feel they have answers, the way I put it is the answers are out there. I may not have all the answers. You may not have the answers, but together we can come up with the answers. And whether it's within the session, whether we look outside ourselves, the answers, there are answers. And sometimes we may not like the answers, but the answers are there. But oftentimes, some of the clients I work with, they don't see themselves as an expert. And I think it's really important to affirm people's resiliency and people's ability to manage difficult times in their life. And sometimes we just need to point out that, you do have the ability to do this. You may not have strengthened that muscle. I have a daughter who will typically say, no, I can't do this. And then after trying it a few times, trying a new skill a few times, she realizes she is able. So the ability is within a person to do things. They may not be aware that just simply practicing a new skill brings out that ability, but the ability is we do have abilities within us and skills. And I'm specifically thinking about strategies we often refer to like containing and managing and coping. And many clients initially don't feel they do have, or many people initially don't feel they have the ability or the resources to cope and contain. But the reality is they do. They just need some guidance in exercising that muscle so then they can become proficient at it. And I think the ability is there, and we just come alongside and help them practice new skills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. Awesome. All right. So that said, some of the items that people may struggle with is, how do you manage your worry about coronavirus? How do you keep that concern at a healthy level rather than into the anxiety disorder range? Any suggestions? I mean, I know we put up an article just the other day about some of those things, but maybe some of you might want to elaborate on that based on that information.
I think one of the things that is particularly helpful for me is to acknowledge that this is ever changing, and that doesn't mean something has gone terribly wrong. The fact that, for example, governments are providing interventions, maybe restricting movement, restricting whatever, it doesn't mean that they don't know what they're doing. It does mean, I think, that the situation is ever changing. We've not faced this particular virus before, and so to address some of the interventions, some of them may seem over the top, but I did hear a politician, and I wish I remembered who it was so I could give credit, but I heard a politician say that they would rather be accused, when all of this is done, they would rather be accused of having overreacted than having not done enough. So I think for me, that's a source of relative calm in the face of something that is ever changing. And I find that helpful.
Mm-hmm, absolutely, yeah.
Can I add something, Jim?
Absolutely, yeah. Just jump right in. You bet.
That's a really good question. Whoever asked that question, I have that a lot within my practice. What is a normal? What would it look like to be normally concerned or reasonably concerned about something without it becoming problematic? And because this is this is something new, many people struggle with the uncertainty and the unknown. So I think we just need to first, like Rae talked about, acknowledgement. I think we need to acknowledge that it's okay to be concerned, that this is an issue that we can be concerned about. When it ventures from being concerned and then having what I would refer to as a kind of a game plan or an approach, a personal approach to this, like what am I personally going to do? I'm going to follow the guidelines that are being described. I'm going to care for my well-being. I'm going to follow the principles of self-care, increasing and strengthening my immune system. Different steps that we're being advised to take. When it goes beyond some very practical and pragmatic steps to sitting with it, fretting, creating in our minds scenes of what this could be like, when we start entertaining it for an extended period of time, rather than understanding what the issue is as best as we can, coming to terms with action steps that we need to take, when it goes beyond that, then I think we're venturing into anxiety behavior. So what I try and help my people I work with is to take a step back, to understand, well, what can you do? What is within your control? And anytime those fear thoughts, which are naturally going to enter your mind, when we notice them, then we just simply gently interrupt them, and we start practicing some of the containment strategies that we have in place to address it. So when it goes beyond understanding what are the practical steps that I need to be taking every day in my life, and it goes to fretting, worrying, catastrophizing, that's when it becomes problematic. And that's when we need to intervene and practice some coping and containment strategies.
Can I add something there, Chris? This is Sheri. Sometimes I talk with people about how, sometimes we have trouble recognizing when I completely agree with Chris. That is exactly when we need to start applying the strategies, is when we go past those practical, things that we would need to do day to day just to be responsible and informed. Sometimes we have a hard time recognizing when that is and knowing when we've crossed that line, because like I mentioned before, when we're in the midst of an anxiety moment, the last thing we really want to think about is what would be an objective approach, or how should this look? Not only do we not maybe want to think about that, when our anxiety levels are high and our stress hormones are high, our prefrontal cortex becomes subdued. And so we can't think as clearly about maybe how we would feel if we weren't feeling so anxious. So one thing I like to tell people is, if you can pretend that you're someone else and you're looking on their life and watching what they're doing instead, how would your actions seem to you? Would they seem like they are reasonable and what you need to do to get through this? Because let's face it, we want our anxiety system in our body. We want the whole setup and emergency response and all of that to work properly in a crisis. We need it. It's valuable. And this is a crisis. And so we have to be, grateful and thankful that we have systems in our body that help us through true crises. So sometimes what we're doing might be appropriate, but how do we recognize? And so sometimes looking around ourselves and saying, okay, if I could picture, if I sat, was a fly on the wall and watched myself, would what I'm thinking and doing, would that seem to me as something that would be sensible for other people to be thinking and doing? And that can sometimes give us a bit of perspective that we don't have when we're thinking just from within. Just a little tip that sometimes helps us find that line that Chris is talking about.
Mm-hmm. That's like being someone advising yourself on how you would manage it. Like we often, or for example, imagine yourself being a parent advising a child how they're behaving. Is that behavior appropriate? So taking that sort of second person look, right? Yeah,
exactly. Mm-hmm. Kind of taking a step outside of ourselves and just deciding. And another thing we can do too is because there is so much information unfolding with this situation, and we seem to be getting new numbers every day and new information every day, and every area is responding differently. And sometimes we can't make choices yet because we don't have enough information. But our anxiety brain will try to tell us that we have to keep thinking about it, worrying about it, and keep dwelling on that until we find a solution. But the reality is, if we don't have enough actual real evidence yet, sometimes we can't make a choice. So when that happens, I like to encourage people to try to put that in a box on the shelf until a later point. Make a little agreement with your subconscious anxiety brain and say, okay, picture yourself, I'm sitting down, I've got a box in front of me, and I have this thing that I'm worried about in here, but I don't have enough information to make a decision yet, so I'm going to pack it away. And as visual as you can be about this really, really is helpful. There's a lot of research that suggests that the more visual we are in how we think about changing our thoughts, the more we're able to really contact the parts of our brain that are more subconscious, because those parts of the brain are also very experiential. So we want to picture packing that away in a box and folding it all up and tying it shut and putting it on a shelf. And then make an agreement with yourself. I'm going to revisit this box in 24 hours or in a week or, in a day, whatever you decide. I mean, you're going to make those guidelines. And then when the thought comes back to you, as it will, because we know how our anxiety brains work, say, no, I did promise you I'd take care of it, and I will when I have the information. Right now it's packed away. And just keep that consistency by acknowledging that you are going to deal with it. It seems to somehow let our anxiety brain calm down a little bit, knowing we are dealing with it, but it also helps us change those thought patterns and neural networks that insist on telling us it has to be solved now, because a lot of it we just can't. We can't make decisions yet because we don't know all we need to know. And that's tough. I mean, that's tough for everybody, whether they suffer from anxiety or not. So again, as we were saying, don't feel bad if you're finding this hard, because I think, everyone is, even people who don't have a history of struggling with anxiety. So.
I just want to piggyback on that too. I mean, that's great information. We're just doing an article right now and shifting the brain out of emergency mode into relaxation mode, because as you mentioned, when the brain has detected a threat, it goes into that emergency mode and its job is to keep us focused on the threat until the threat is passed. So as you mentioned, well, we don't know what's going to happen, so the brain's going to continue focus on that threat. But if we don't know what's going to happen, we could remain plugged in there for the duration. So that's why it's important to give us those tools to shift the brain out of emergency mode so it can sort of gear down and relax, and I like how you say, package it up, put it away, and then dig it out later, knowing that you are doing something, but you don't have to do it now. That's, shifts the brain out of that surveillance and high detection mode. So I think that's good information. The other thing too is just one more thing before you jump in again here is, we've always, we like to make a distinction between constructive concern versus destructive concern. That's what you were talking about earlier, Chris, where there's an appropriate action that we need to take, but then when we go way beyond it by worrying all the time, because worry solves nothing. And, worry really is an unhealthy behavior that achieves nothing. But if we stay in that surveillance and worry, we've gone beyond the appropriate area. So I like that part of that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
The thing about worrying is that it gives the perception that we're doing something. I know when I was worrying, when I was engaged with my problematic anxiety, I always felt that worrying allowed me to do something. And one thing that I hear and I work with clients is, what does worrying do for you? And sometimes it gives people some of the information that I hear back is it gives individuals a false sense of control, and it feels like they can do something about it. So I really like what Sheri shared. It's an excellent strategy, and that we also need to acknowledge that people are preparing. They feel that the worrying, the fretting, is doing something constructive for them, but it really isn't. So we need to ask, what is it? One of the questions that we can ask ourselves is, what do we want our worrying to do for us? What outcomes are we trying to gain? What value is catastrophizing doing for us? We may think it's not having anything, but really, people are saying, well, it makes me plan and prepare. Well, that's great. It's excellent. Planning, preparing, those are great things to do. Now we need to ask, well, what's the most effective strategy to plan and prepare? So one of the questions that I ask is, if your fear were to happen, how would you cope? How would you manage it? What would you do? Knowing that that's likely not going to happen. Usually our worst case scenarios never happen. But if it did, what would you do? And that could be a springboard for people to start asking themselves productive questions. Well, what do I need to do right now? Whether it is related to the coronavirus or whether it is related to any other health-related fear. Some of my clients are afraid to just simply venture out of their home and onto their veranda or go for a walk on the sidewalk. And that was even before the coronavirus. Worrying about it gives them a false perception that they're doing something about it. So there's a very real need for people to feel that they are actually able to do something about the worst case scenario. So I think there's value in spending time and acknowledging that fear and also problem solving around it. And so we engage in some problem solving strategies.
So developing an action plan is helpful to contain worry, correct?
I think that's one of many steps, but a very, very important one. Mm-hmm. Another one is what we often refer to as changing our perception. Are our perceptions about what's happening based in reality, based in hope? Or do we have a set of lenses that we look through our issues that are more fear-based and pessimistic? Mm-hmm. And what would it look like for it to be more realistic and optimistic? So having an action plan is one strategy. Identifying what are our underlying fears, and then creating a method of replacing those fears with something rational and optimistic. And then also creating a plan of how to make that kind of thinking, a rational, optimistic type of mindset, more consistent in a way of life for a person, as opposed to their typical pattern of thinking being pessimistic and hopeless and helpless in nature. So I would say an action plan, but then there's some of the cognitive behavioral strategies that we often talk about doing with our clients that's important.
Absolutely. And then also, like, some of what Chris is talking about is often what I refer to when I talk with my clients as covering the what ifs. So we want to be realistic and base what we believe and our decisions out of what's truthful and really happening, rather than what our anxiety brain might be telling us. And so we want to be making sure we're doing that as much as we can, but at the same time, there is always that chance something could happen. We can't eliminate risk completely. And so that's when I call it the covering the what ifs, because the brain will be like, yeah, but what if it happens anyway? What if this? What if that? And so that's when we say, okay, at this point, what do I do? Do I have an action plan for, like Chris said, for, whatever my worst case scenario fear is? But is that enough, or does my brain keep trying to throw other what ifs at me? So at what point do I maybe decide that the things I don't have control over, I need to search elsewhere in my life for a place where I can hand that over? For some people, that means, their own spiritual life or spiritual practices. For other people, it's other internal resources they have. But just work on trusting ourselves that despite the fact that, we can't think of every possible thing that could ever go wrong in life, nor should we be trying to. we can trust the resources that we have by looking at the evidence from the past and knowing how well we've handled other things. We'll never guess a worst case scenario perfectly. Even if it happens, there will be things involved in that worst case scenario that didn't go as we thought they would. So our chance of guessing that 100% correctly is zero. So we have to really understand that we have to trust what we know we have inside ourselves. We've got all these internal resources and then external resources, friends, family, education, knowledge, experience, all these things that we can put trust in when there is an unknown there and when those what ifs fly at us anyway. And training ourselves to be able to rest in that confidence and not allowing our brain to try to keep telling us that's not good enough. So just a little bit to add to all of what Chris was saying, which I really appreciated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I do have a question here, actually, Jim, when we get a second, that a client sent to me. So whenever you feel like this part is kind of wrapped up.
All right, sounds good.
Because we could potentially keep going on this
yes,
forever.
we sure could, yeah. I think it might be also worthwhile just talking about, why do some people worry and why do others seem not to? From an anxiety perspective, why do anxious people worry? Why has that become our security blanket?
One of the things I was thinking as both Chris and Sheri were talking was the importance of being able to externally express what's going on inside our anxiety brain. I think when we keep it contained within our own thinking and we don't feel that we maybe can share with what if this happens, or looking at those worst case scenarios. I think when we feel we don't have the freedom or whatever to express it externally, the worry just is self-generating because it doesn't have an outlet. It just stays there and festers and becomes incredibly overwhelming and quite debilitating. And I know that when maybe addressing your question, Jim, about why do some people seem to worry about pretty much everything and others don't. For some, I think it's because they have those external outlets. They can maybe talk to a family member or close friend or through prayer, whatever avenue they choose. It's no longer something I am carrying all by myself. I now have included somebody else, and that opens up the possibility to different perspectives.
Mm-hmm. I like what you said. The thing that used to really bother me is when, for years, anxiety disorder was medicalized. Oh, there's something wrong with your brain. And so what happens over the course of time is we feel that feeling anxious is bad. And so, just going with what you said, if we have the notion that feeling anxious is bad and it's a, quote, disorder, then we don't talk about it freely because a lot of people won't understand and there's stigma there. So I like what's happening now is that, the studies have shown that anxiety disorder is not caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain, not caused by a genetic predisposition. It's a behavioral thing. So we can talk about it more. And just one more thing, too, is that I think it's great that we're able to say, hey, I'm anxious. this makes me nervous. Rather than, I can't say anything. It can't look bad. I don't, what are people going to think? But if we're more vocal about it, then we can get that reassurance that things are going to be okay, or at least talk about it so we feel that we're doing something about it. So I completely agree with what you said.
I think that also, too, some of it comes down to conclusions that our brain drew when we were young. So if for whatever reason something happened to us when we were young, as we know most of the things that are going to guide kind of what's in the core circle of our beliefs is happening before we're 7. So sometimes when we're young, something will happen to us that may not seem like a big deal now. It doesn't even have to be really horrific. It could just be something that at the time was very difficult for you. And your brain, you worried about it, and then everything turned out okay. And sometimes that is the beginning of a pattern where the brain decides that it worked. We worried, everything turned out okay. Look at that. So then it's more willing to try that pattern again, tries it again, everything works out again. Now we know, objectively speaking, that probably those things were going to work out just fine anyway, but your brain is under the impression that it is working out because you did the worrying behavior. And the one thing about our that part of our brain is that it has a tendency to look for all the evidence that proves it right, and it tends to really want to forget or not notice the stuff that proves it wrong. And so that can be a snowball that over our lifetime, worrying just becomes our go-to behavior for dealing with anything that is concerning. And then when we don't stop to question it, that pattern gets stronger and stronger. So I think sometimes it can be just as simple as a little thing. Sometimes it's traumatic things, but it just goes to show that a lot of it, the difference between someone who struggles with worrying and someone who doesn't, it's not really something they've done, even though it's a behavioral condition. It's often what happened to them in their early lives,
I think too, it's what happened to them, but also how the parents responded to that event. I'll just give an example. I mean, we're kind of blessed where we have a lot of grandkids and we see a lot of different parenting styles, and we see parents who are really anxious raising children. So when something happens, it's like, oh my gosh, come here, let me come. Oh, it's just, it's really bad. Oh, and make a great big deal out of this thing. Like, for example, a child falls down, bangs his arm and it's sore, and a child's crying. So they make a huge deal out of that event. Whereas another parent is like, yeah, you'll be all right. You'll be okay. Yeah, it hurts. Yeah, you're fine. And so look at the two parenting styles. If a traumatic event was made into be a great big catastrophe, which it was for my family, I remember being a child, throwing up because I had the flu, and my parents just had a fit. Oh my gosh, it's like running around and should we call the doctor? Should we take him to the hospital? It's just like this great big thing.
Yeah.
Where if it's normalized, yeah, you're going to be okay. Well, then the child doesn't look at these traumatic events as being, disasters. And so when challenges come their way, they're more able to be resilient and say, well, I'll get through it, no big deal. Whereas when we come from an anxious background, we don't have that mindset, so we react the way we do. And then if we don't have skills to manage those difficulties, well, then worry becomes our go-to, like you say, and then it becomes habituated, and that's just what we do as our first automatic response to uncertainty. So, there's lots of different ways we develop that worry, but we have to really remember that worry is a habit and it's a behavior. We can change behaviors. We can look at things differently. Anyway, I just wanted to piggyback on because what you said was great.
That's absolutely. I had the same experience with my parents as a child, and then I ended up with anxiety. So yep. I totally get it. Yep. So anyway.
Yeah,
and it's interesting because I've seen research that suggests that people who counter their anxiety, work on their, actually it's quite compelling evidence, but that are working on their anxiety and counter their anxiety, that is actually protective for their children, which just goes to show that when we change how we respond to something, that's changing what they're observing and taking in. So yeah, absolutely. What our parents do in front of us is a huge part of that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The other piece that goes along with that catastrophizing is, for me, it was my parents when something negative happened, and I wasn't too distressed about it, but they made a big deal of it. And of course, the bottom line for them was, well, how could you be so stupid? How could you make that dumb decision? You need to think better next time. Well, as a child, when you get that information, it's like, all right, so in order for me not to get into trouble, I have to think of all the possible scenarios that can cause danger. Of course, when you just imagine those by themselves, you're scaring yourself with all the things that can happen. And then that overthinking and over-practicalization becomes a way of life, which becomes the worry habit too. So there's lots of different ways we develop worry.